Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Game of Thrones video on Daenerys Targaryen, how she is not the villain of the series. In this video, I examine the character of Daenerys Targaryen, how her storyline on the show has evolved thus far, and in which direction it might go in the future. So I have to give it a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to Season 6. If you haven't seen all of Season 6, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So the main inspiration behind this video is a common theory I've seen going around the interwebs that Daenerys Targaryen is going to be the true villain of the show. I've seen several seemingly convincing videos from channels that tend to put out good content about how it is likely Daenerys is the ultimate bad guy of the story. However, I did not title this video Daenerys villain or hero because I think the answer is obvious and the theories on her being a villain are absurd and born out of a natural hatred of this character, a bias against her, if you will. Now, I've been on record saying Daenerys is one of my favorite, if not my favorite character of Game of Thrones TV show, but for some reason, quite a sizable group has emerged that despise this character. Now, I'm not going to try to talk this group down or convince them otherwise because everyone has their personal taste and that's fine. For example, one of my least favorite characters of the entire series is Jaime Lannister, when I know there's a sizable fan base that adores this character, and that's fine. I'm not here to talk about personal preference or which character one should or should not like. But I do believe this fan base has let their hatred of Daenerys influence their theory making and have thus put out some really strong theories that may have convinced others that Daenerys is the true villain of the show, when in actuality this is clearly not the case. It's funny, several of these theory videos I saw claim that the White Walkers are not the true villains of the series because George R. R. Martin typically avoids Lord of the Rings style good versus evil stories, and thus wouldn't end with a dynamic that was so simplistic, and instead George likes to deal in shades of gray. However, these same people then go on to say that Daenerys is the villain of the series because she represents war and taking things by force. But wait a second, aren't you just contradicting yourselves there? You say that the White Walkers aren't villains because George R. R. Martin doesn't work in simple terms, but then go on to say that Daenerys is the villain. I'm sorry, but that's just ridiculous. I second that George R. R. Martin doesn't deal in Lord of the Rings style good versus evil and is more complex and realistic than that, which is why I would say Daenerys is neither hero nor villain, but is more of a shade of gray, just like every other character in the show. However, although there are no straight out heroes or villains in the show, certain characters do tend to lean certain ways, much in the way you could equate heroic values to characters like Jon Snow, Brienne of Tarth, and Robb Stark, and these tend to be characters that the audience roots for, whereas characters like Joffrey Baratheon, Ramsay Bolton, and Cersei Lannister tend to lean more towards villainous tendencies and tend to be characters you want to fail. In those terms, I feel Daenerys lays more in the same category with Jon Snow, Robb Stark, and Brienne of Tarth, as someone you would root for rather than want to see fail. So let me address some of the base arguments I've seen about why Daenerys is going to become the main villain of the series. First one is that she is going to be the Mad Queen, just like her father. People often point to her bloodline and how her father was a mad tyrant that burned people alive for enjoyment and speculate she may end up following his footsteps and become the Mad Queen. Some people, to show how to illustrate this, talk about how she burned the masters at Astapor alive with her dragons, fed a random master to one of her dragons after Barristan Selmy was killed, and when in fact this particular master may had nothing to do with this, and how she burned all the cows at Vaes Dothrak alive. Okay, so first off, with the burning of the masters of Astapor. These were slave owners that took children away from their parents, cut off their private parts, mutilated them, turned them into mindless warriors by having them kill random babies in the night, and they profited off of this and by keeping an entire people in slavery. In other words, these guys are equatable to the worst tyrants in history, and I dare say it because it's so overused, but yes, even equatable to Hitler. And you're going to call her evil because she killed Hitler and freed an entire people from anguish, a life of perpetual torture, misery, and slavery? Okay. If you're going to do that, I might suggest that you might be the one that is mad, not her. And similarly to killing the cows of Vay's Dothraki, who at that moment that she killed them promised to have her repeatedly raped by all of their men and horses before suffering a long, torturous death, and in addition were plotting to use the Dothraki to rape, pillage innocent villagers who harmed no one, and in so killing them, took command of the Dothraki and used them in her fight to free the slaves of Meereen before turning to Westeros to put an end to the perpetual wars that have been plaguing that country and harming the small folk, which she made clear in her wheel speech to Tyrion. So again, if you would call her mad for doing that, it's your morals I would question, not hers. As for feeding a random master to a dragon, that is a little bit harder to defend. But I dare say she acted no different than any other lord of Westeros would act. Imagine, for example, how Stannis would react if he did indeed take King's Landing, but a resistance group loyal to the Lannisters arose and set out a series of terrorist attacks, and in one of them, his right-hand man Davos was killed. You're totally fooling yourselves if you think his reaction wouldn't be just as, if not more brutal than her reaction was. I could totally see him rounding up a group of people suspected of being loyal to the Lannisters and having one of them killed at random. In fact, many of the other more brutal lords of Westeros would react much worse than she did. Imagine, for example, how Tywin Lannister, Roose Bolton, or Balon Greyjoy would have reacted to such defiance. I say it's likely they would have simply killed everyone suspected of being involved, not just one person. In fact, with Tywin, we don't even have to imagine because we know that he had women and children raped and killed when they sacked King's Landing during Robert's Rebellion. So there you have it. However, I would add that the show has indeed set up a dynamic that Dan and Dave have talked about in interviews, where Daenerys does have that sort of madness side to her, but they've also made it clear that she's actively trying to combat it and trying to be not like her father. Barristan, Jorah, and Tyrion had given her lectures on how not to be like her father and to be more merciful, and each time that they did, she heeded their advice. More significantly, an example of this is towards the end of Season 6, when she returned to Meereen with Drogon and a Dothraki army and simply wanted to kill all of the Masters and anyone working for them and burn all their cities to the ground. That was her Mad King tendency coming out, but Tyrion could see that and warned her of the dangers of succumbing to such temptations, even if many other conquerors in Westeros would have done the same in order to prevent the enslavement and suffering of an entire people. However, Tyrion talked her down from that by telling her the dangers of succumbing to such feelings, and she very wisely listened to him and heeded his advice, and instead of killing a bunch of slave soldiers, she instead just destroyed a couple of ships to show the true might of her dragons and killed 2 out of the 3 leaders of the Masters and spared all the other slave soldiers who saw what was happening and simply left. And thus, she made an example of them and showed off her might, and thus defeated the Masters of Slavers Bay once and for all with minimal bloodshed. Not at all what a Mad Queen would do. But if you want to talk about Mad Queen, you're looking at the wrong queen and need to look no further than Cersei Lannister, who, unlike Daenerys, whose whole cause in Slaver's Bay is to look after the common people, Cersei has proved time and time again she doesn't give two shits about the common people, and in fact rose to queen by killing a lot of innocent people and celebrating it with a glass of wine. If you want to talk about Mad Queen, Cersei's your gal, not Daenerys. Now, it's also been put into question what Daenerys will do once she gets to Westeros, and many have pointed to the fact that a large portion of her forces are made up of Dothraki, and as I mentioned earlier, are notorious for raping and pillaging and turning innocent villagers into slaves. In fact, I once got a comment on one of my videos that insisted that Daenerys was the true villain, as she was bringing a bunch of Dothraki savages over to Westeros to rape, murder, and turn everyone into slaves. And I was just like, dude, that is so impressive. You're so good at writing anti-Daenerys propaganda. The Lannisters should hire you. In fact, I'm sure that's exactly the kind of propaganda Cersei will be putting out there to turn people against Daenerys when she arrives. She'll also mention something about the demon monkey that Daenerys has chosen to be her hand, whom we saw through Lady Crane's play, that what the populace thinks of Tyrion. So that would be another great selling point for her. But getting back to the Dothraki, as many may say that's actually a good point, as the Dothraki has been established to be bloodthirsty savages bent on conquering the innocent. Let's look at their new role in Daenerys' army, though, which, like so many things this season, the show kind of yada through because they seemed really eager now to just rush to the ending. However, they did drop a couple of subtle hints on what that role might be, so let's examine this. Just before Daenerys burned all the cows, effectively the entire leadership of the Dothraki alive, she criticized them for the role in raping and pillaging and taking slaves. In fact, her whole MO in Slaver's Bay has been to free slaves and get rid of slavery, so it seems rather obvious that she wouldn't be okay with the Dothraki taking slaves either. And when Daenerys made her truce with Yara Greyjoy, she made the Ironborn swear off of raiding and reaving and in order to join her alliance. So again, if she doesn't tolerate this sort of thing from the Ironborn, why in the hell would she tolerate it from the Dothraki? Now, some may argue that even if Daenerys forbids this sort of behavior, the Dothraki still won't be able to help themselves because it's in their nature to do so, which may be true to an extent. However, the important thing to recall here is that Daenerys effectively killed the entire Dothraki leadership, and because of the manner in which she did it, the surviving Dothraki worship her as if she's some sort of goddess because of the manner in which she did it, which is made all the more clear in her speech when she was writing Drogon, which, contrary to what many people have stated, I feel was entirely necessary for the show, as the Dothraki are a culture of horse riders, so having a dragon rider would be the ultimate symbol of them for a god to be worshipped and obeyed. So I would equate their devotion to Daenerys at this point to that of a religious devotion to their revered figure. Therefore, I think if she tells them not to raid and pillage, they won't raid and pillage out of a sense of religious devotion, not to mention fear of retribution. Again, the show kind of yada past this, but I think that this or the equivalent will be explained more in detail in the books. Sure, it's possible a few stray Dothraki may try to get away with some bullshit when she's not looking, but this happens in any army, even in Robb Stark's army. As I said, he's been shown as a honorable, noble figure, and yet there were the men that Brienne encountered that had women hanged simply for sleeping with Lannister soldiers. So a few stragglers are to be expected. This doesn't make Daenerys a villain any more than those men make Robb Stark a villain. So I've also seen many others point to the fact that Daenerys did such a shitty job with Meereen on why she would be a horrible ruler who would resort to violence. However, this I feel misunderstands the entire purpose of the Meereen storyline, which was to show the growing pains of her becoming a ruler and her having to learn that it's not as easy as it sounds. She kind of just blindly went in naively thinking she could just do whatever she wanted, and the reality of it punched back. But in the end, she learned from the experience and grew as a person and as a leader, and plus has someone like Tyrion at her side now who knows the ins and outs of Westeros politics. In fact, I would say that the naysayers tend to latch on to the elements of her character that are meant to show her as complex and not perfect, and exaggerate them to show her as evil, while ignoring the other elements of her character that contradict this. Thus, ultimately, she's not evil like every character in George R.R. Martin's stories. She's complex. So as to the question of whether I believe Daenerys is a hero or villain, as I stated earlier, she's neither. Just another great character and realistic character created brilliantly by George R.R. Martin. In fact, those that claim she is a villain tend to create this false dichotomy argument where the only choices you have is either she's this brilliant, perfectly good, heavenly hero who's going to save the world by heroically defeating the evil White Walkers and ruling Westeros happily ever after, or she's a villain. And that is a false dichotomy, or what is known as a black and white argument, where one presents only two options and claims these are the only two options. One of those options is a ridiculous option, so then that must mean, of course, the other option is the case, which ignores the entire vast spectrum of options. In fact, in this case, it ignores which to me is the most reasonable and obvious one, the one most consistent with George R.R. Martin's writing style and what we've seen on the show so far, and that is neither of these options are the case. What will actually happen with Daenerys is much more complex and gray than that, and that is that Daenerys will have good intentions and will ultimately work to make Westeros a better place, but isn't going to be perfect. She's going to stumble along the way, make some more mistakes, possibly do some more shady things, and a Mad King type action to further her goals, but ultimately will work to do what is best for Westeros. And those who have seen my other theories videos will note that I'm pretty damn sure that she and her dragons will die by the end of the series. So I have a very strong feeling that her ending will be quite far from happy. So enough of this false dichotomy BS coming from those claiming to base their theories off of George R.R. Martin's writing style, which his style is always to be more complex than that. Also, these theories ignore the basis of the inspiration for Daenerys' character, which many historians have noted, and George R.R. Martin himself admitted was an inspiration for her character, and that is of Henry VII, who lived most of his life in exile, and having the throne having been taken from his family, who eventually returned to England as an adult with an army made up of mostly foreign mercenaries, and managed to retake the throne for his family by defeating King Richard III in battle. Now, I'm not saying that Daenerys' storyline will go down exactly the same way. He's just the inspiration. There are obviously many things different from their stories, but he is the inspiration, and one can't completely toss that aside, which I do believe that those who claim Daenerys is the true villain are doing. And yes, I think this does make it likely that Daenerys will gain the Iron Throne, at least for a while, but I personally don't think that it will be permanent. And another figure, this one from A Song of Ice and Fire lore, that I feel people often forget about, is Aegon the Conqueror. In fact, I think people forget about the significance of this historical figure when crafting theories about the future of the story. I've already done a whole video about him and how I feel his backstory is what will have most relevance for the future of Daenerys' story, as he and his two sister wives were the three dragon riders that conquered Westeros, which is why I believe Daenerys' story will mirror that, and she and two male riders will ride the three dragons to free Westeros from the White Walker invasion, thus mirroring the two major historical events in Westeros, the Long Night and Aegon's Conquest, where the two will come together to create the Song of Ice and Fire. In fact, I nearly named this video, Is Daenerys the Second Coming of Aegon the Conqueror? Because honestly, I think that's the more pressing question to ask, rather than whether or not she's a villain, because the answer to that question is really obviously no. Whereas, there's more evidence to show that Daenerys' storyline may mirror Aegon's in some way. Now, Aegon himself wasn't perfect, and although is a revered hero, he killed a lot of people in his time, and most certainly did a lot of morally questionable things, which I'm sure Daenerys will as well, but his ultimate goal was to unite Westeros, as to, I believe, will Daenerys. Now, as for the White Walkers and how these videos claim that they aren't the true villains but Daenerys is, well, at least one of those videos was made after Season 6, so I believe they should know better than that by now, because Season 6 has brought on some more insight of the true nature of the White Walkers, which is more than we even know in the books. And that is, we now know the origins of the White Walkers, and that they were created by the Children of the Force to be used as a weapon of mass destruction against the First Men whom they were at war with at the time. But they have since outgrown their usefulness, now are out of control. In the review I did for that episode, I compared the White Walkers to the original Star Trek episode, The Doomsday Machine, where there was a planet-killing machine and used as a weapon of mass destruction that just grew out of control and have long since survived the race that built it, which were wiped out centuries ago. The machine was still going around destroying planets. And I think that's the best analogy to the White Walkers is, like the Doomsday Machine, they are a warning against weapons of mass destruction and the dangers of war, which is completely in keeping with George R. R. Martin's anti-war leanings, in which many cite as an example of why there will be no war with the White Walkers. And as I stated, Martin was the same man who created characters like Ramsay and Joffrey, who pretty much have no redeeming qualities, and I feel the White Walkers will fall into that same category. That doesn't make them pure evil. It doesn't make them Sauron, as many who create this false dichotomy would suggest. They're still complex characters, as they represent anti-war, anti-weapons of mass destruction messages. But for the purposes of the story, I do think it is obvious they will be the destructive force in Westeros, and by far the main villains for the ending of the series. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a war, Lord of the Rings type style war where there's good versus evil, as many who create these false dichotomies would suggest. In fact, I would very much compare this to the Battle of the Bastards, where we had the good Stark forces versus the evil Bolton forces. However, that battle was far from the simplicity of a Lord of the Rings type good versus evil battle, as will this battle be. And will also have more complexity and realism than simply Daenerys being the good guy coming in with her dragons to defeat the evil White Walkers. It will be way more complex, just like the Battle of the Bastards was, and just like the White Walkers are already shown to be, as they're created by the Children of the Forest to protect them from aggressive invaders. So it's already shown to be a complex issue. That doesn't equate to Daenerys and not the White Walkers being the villain of the series. So that's it for my video on how Daenerys is not the villain of the series. Please be sure to check out my many other Game of Thrones videos, as I try to do at least one a week. And also check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Star Trek, Mr. Robot, Dark Matter, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.